to help you with attachment revision. So, caregiver and infant interactions. So, obviously, it's to do with the communication between the caregiver and the infant, and kind of whether that has significance in terms of the development of attachments. So, the first type of interaction is reciprocity. So, this is to do with the caregiver, doing some kind of action, and then the infant responds to that in a specific way. So, for example, the mother might nod her head, and then the baby might also nod their head in response to that. And the key thing to make sure that you say in terms of an example about this is the response has to come from the infant. It can't be the other way round, because then it doesn't show that the infant's attached. So if the infant did something and the caregiver imitated it, then that doesn't necessarily show an attachment, because adults would know to react. Whereas if the baby responds, then it's indicative that there is a attachment there. So in terms of your example, make sure you say the baby responds to the caregiver. These are usually kind of non-verbal, like facial expressions, little sort of mini actions. And then Brazelton can be used in kind of a short mark question about this to say that he compares this idea to a dance because the partners are responding to each other. And infants go through what's called an alert phase. So that's a period of time where they're specifically focused on wanting to have interactions with their caregivers. And then Feldman says that mothers typically pick up on this around 2/3 of the time, and then the interactions will take place. And this kind of demonstrates that infants can play like an active role in forming attachments. And then secondly, we've got interactional synchrony. So this means that the actions take place at the same time. So if the mum and the baby are both waving at each other at the same time. So the actions mirror each other, and then Feldman obviously is the person you can use for the definition there. And then if it's kind of a shorter mark question, so I don't know, a 4 mark asking you to kind of outline both of these, or an 8 mark question asking you to discuss interactional synchrony, you would be fine just kind of using Feldman and an example, possibly Meseltoff and more if you want to, but I would save a Bravenel and De Jong study for evaluation as either supporting evidence, or you could possibly use it as an overall as well. So Meseltoff and Moore are saying that children as young as 2 weeks old can take part in this sort of behaviour. So as soon as they pass through the kind of asocial stage of the stages of attachment, they're ready to kind of have these sorts of interactions. So it happens from a very, very early stage. And then in terms of your discussion points, your first one is asking whether there are valid findings. So in terms of internal validity, you could say like one strength is that there's often well-controlled procedures, and obviously if something's well controlled and has like a standard replicable procedure, that means that when you generate a specific finding, then other psychologists could replicate that and potentially falsify it. So Meseltoff and Moore stated that babies as young as 2 weeks are mirroring their caregivers' interactions. Another psychologist could do that with babies that are 2 weeks old and attempt to falsify that hypothesis. But if they also found there was an indication that they were interacting in that way, then that would add credibility to their argument. So by having well-controlled procedures, other psychologists can replicate and then hopefully confirm the validity of the findings. Also, babies are not impacted by domain characteristics. So that means that babies don't understand the aim of the study. They don't really understand that they're in a study, so they won't behave differently under lab conditions as they would in their usual naturalistic environment. So that's a strength because it means that any interaction that they have with their caregiver is reflective of a genuine attachment rather than it being part of the experiment. So they're not going to be more alert in terms of their responses to the caregiver because they're in an experiment, because they don't care. Which increases the internal validity because the relationship and the actions are a true reflection of how they would act. And then disadvantage is that we have very little understanding of whether these actions are conscious and deliberate. So because babies obviously are quite immobile, they don't have much control over their movements, do we know that they're interacting in that way deliberately, and does it actually have a special meaning? And we can't really know that. And also the fact that infants can't speak, they can't actually explain why they're behaving in that way. So that has limitations as a result. And then in terms of your overall, you can say, like, obviously, if we keep repeating these experiments and infants continue to act in the same way, then it probably is a deliberate movement, because it's not a coincidence that all infants are acting in the same way. So if several studies are coming to the same conclusions, it suggests that the actions are deliberate. Or you could say this idea that studies have been done and they found that babies don't act, they don't imitate the movements of toys. So they are doing it specifically to humans and specifically to caregivers. So therefore it suggests that it is a special meaning. There is a special meaning. There is a specific attachment that's taken place. So there's further support for that idea. Do caregiver interactions lead to stronger attachments? So yes, this idea that researchers assessed the quality of mother and infant attachment and they were associated with higher levels of synchrony. So there was a positive correlation between quality of attachment and the interactions that they had with each other. And then Feldman is saying that actually that isn't particularly helpful because correlation doesn't establish causation. So we can see that there is a relationship between the two, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the actions in terms of interactional synchrony and reciprocity are what actually cause the quality of attachment. So therefore it may lack use if we don't know the reasons behind it. And then in terms of the overall, you could say that it's still very useful for us to understand the quality of attachment, because then it allows future research to be done in terms of like longitudinal studies about the quality of attachment and like future relationships, etc. So even though we don't necessarily know what causes the high quality attachment, it's still useful for us in terms of looking at child development. So the findings are still relevant. Further evaluation that you could use, we've got the point that it's potentially socially sensitive. So this idea of having less time to interact with your child could potentially have negative consequences in development that might cause sort of discrimination against women who are returning to work, etc., or make them feel a sense of blame maybe, or a sense of concern around their child if they're not interacting with them in the same way. So it's socially sensitive, and then not necessarily applicable to other cultures. So it's kind of Western imposed ethic in terms of how they perceive interactions should take place, Whereas in African cultures, mothers often carry their baby on their back, so they can't always obviously see them. They're not face to face, so they wouldn't necessarily be engaging in reciprocal actions. But the closeness and the comfort is what actually assists the formation of the attachment. So these ideas are quite Western and ethnocentric, possibly because they're suggesting that these things need to happen in order to form an attachment, but there are other ways to interact with your child that don't necessarily require face-to-face physical movements as such. Okay, attachment figures. So role of the father. So Shaffer and Emerson, obviously, they do the stages of attachment, and they say that the first attachment is usually with the mother because they're the primary attachment figure, and then later they form the secondary attachment with their fathers. And Grossman looked at the kind of role that fathers have, and they found that the role fathers play is more to do with play, so the quality of the play and the leisure and the fun times is more what the fathers do, and then the mother, it was more to do with the nurturing. So in terms of like how successful children were in their relationships when they were adolescents, so teenagers, was related to like how much their father played with them and how nurturing their mother was. It wasn't to do with anything else that the father could have been doing. So this idea that there's a specific role that fathers have. And then we've got further support for this idea that comes from Geiger. So confirming the kind of credibility of Grossman's argument that it is to do with play. But then Field criticises this, and she is saying that if the father is the primary caregiver, then they can take on a nurturing role. So actually, it's not to do with the sex of the parent, it's actually just to do with who spends most time with the child, who is the primary caregiver. So essentially, if the male was the primary caregiver, then their quality of nurturing could possibly be more significant than the mother's quality of nurturing. And then in the overall, you could say, arguably, the findings from research by Geiger and Grossman suffer from alpha bias and suggest that there's a significant difference between the role when actually sex is less significant. And has society created the role of the father as secondary? So, yes, this idea that it's a social construction. So, the reason why women tend to be having the primary attachment, the first attachment, and the stronger, possibly, attachment with children is because we have a society that's based around the idea that women should be the ones to stay at home and be the carer of the children. But then other psychologists have suggested that there is a biological element to it. So female hormones such as estrogen, obviously neurotransmitter oxytocin is released in the higher levels are within women, and that's a bonding hormone. So that would mean that they're more likely to form attachments with their children than the father would. And then in your overall, you could say that because research is showing that if fathers are the primary caregivers, they're just as effective, then it suggests that actually it is a social construction rather than there actually being something that significant that's biological. Or you could say maybe, arguably, in the first few weeks, as women's oxytocin levels are higher after childbirth, etc., they might form the initial bond quite quickly, but in terms of when the child forms the stages of attachment, when a child actually forms specific attachments, by that stage the father would have definitely kind of caught up with the process. So it's actually insignificant to say that hormones played that bigger role. Evaluation extra. So Spicer, there's a growing emphasis on the role of father. So it's becoming much more significant now. So ultimately, we just got this idea that there is a change happening, and society did sort of create this original, like traditional segregated roles where women are the primary carers, whereas now in Western societies, but also globally, we can see that there is greater involvement from the father, and that now research is suggesting that sex is less relevant. And then obviously, we've already sort of said about alpha bias, but essentially, it's problematic to suggest that women are more likely to form stronger attachments with their child and be better suited to the role, because it's detrimental to men, because obviously those that are taking the primary caregiver role may be viewed in a negative way and viewed in an inferior way. But also problematic for women, because it's suggesting that their role should be the primary carer, and kind of removes that element of choice in terms of which partner would be better placed at home caring for children. Stages of attachment. So Sheffer and Emerson, 60 Babies, working class from Glasgow. They asked, so self-report, and they asked how the infant responded to the adult leaving the room, etc., to strangers, so measuring separation and stranger anxiety. And also the researchers assessed that as well, so also partly an observation. 4 different stages of attachment. So asocial stage is essentially, there's not much difference in kind of how they behave towards non-human objects, so toys, etc., and humans. Indiscriminate stage, so around 2 months to 7 months, is the idea that babies don't kind of discriminate in who they show preference for, but they will be kind of more easily comforted by familiar adults, but generally they will accept comfort from everybody, and they don't show separation anxiety, they don't show stranger anxiety. So there's not a specific adult that they would prefer. They would act in the same way, whether it was an auntie, uncle, cousin, new person that they've only met a few times, etc., the mother. And then specific, so 65% of the time they become attached to the biological mother at around 7 months. And it's not always the person they spend the most time with, but it is the person they interact with the most, and the one that is the most kind of effective in responding to their alert signals, to the alert phases. And then multiple attachments, often within a month of the primary attachment, and this is usually with the father, obviously, and then grandparents, etc. Is this supported with valid findings? So because they used a longitudinal study, this increased the internal validity because it removed participant variables. So what that means is they used the same participants when they were 2 weeks old, when they were 2 months old, when they were a year old, etc. So then any changes in their attachment style is much more likely to be to do with their age, rather to do with the fact that they were using different children, because they weren't, they were using the same children. So if they were to use different children, then maybe their attachment, what appeared to be their attachment style has changed, could actually just be the older children could have been like more social, more extroverted, etc. So that's why they were forming multiple attachments. But because they were using the same participants, it appeared that if they got to 1 year old and suddenly were forming more attachments, that was a genuine change in their behaviour that happened due to age. So it increases the internal validity because we know that the relationship or the change in their attachment style is due to their age rather than it being something that was different between the participants because they use the same participants. The researcher lacks external validity because they used children just from Glasgow, just from working class backgrounds, so we can't apply the findings to children outside of those geographical area and social class backgrounds. So therefore, it has limited use because we can't explain the behaviour or apply it to those from other backgrounds. Is there support for... Oh, sorry. Overall, you can say because there's internal validity, you could use that research design again and conduct it in other places. So then that would allow generalizations to be made. So essentially, overall, the psychologists from different areas could repeat the same study, and then if the same findings were confirmed, then it would be, the findings would be generalizable. Is there supporting evidence? So Bowlby, monotropy, this idea that one caregiver is more significant than others, and children do form a specific attachment with one caregiver first before moving on to the multiple attachment phase. And then Van Ingendorm is saying that it's less applicable to other cultures, those who are kind of brought up in a cultural context where it's the norm to have multiple caregivers, so aunties, uncles, grandparents, etc. They might just not actually go through the specific attachment phase, so they might go straight from the indiscriminate to multiple. And then overall, you can just say that the stage theory can therefore only be applicable to Western cultures, or you could say like the argument that it should understand that its findings are only kind of culturally relative and not kind of falsely claim that the attachment stages are a kind of universal feature of behaviour. Okay, animal studies. So this is the idea that animals have a evolutionary drive, so a natural instinct to form attachments. So Lorenz looked at imprinting, so he did a lab experiment and he divided some eggs into two groups. So the control group stayed with the mother goose, and then the experimental group were with they were with Lorenz, sorry. Then the control group followed the mother goose, the experimental group followed Lorenz. This is known as imprinting, so essentially what's a baby goose called? I don't know. Geeseling? The geeseling? Demonstrated imprinting because they followed the first moving object. And they have a critical period, so imprinting has to take place in that time. So that happens within the first few hours, and they have to do that, or they will struggle to form any attachment later on. And obviously that can happen within a few hours because geese are born mobile. So this point you can use for both Lorenz and Harlow. So are animal studies useful in understanding human attachment? So yes, because there's this idea of a critical period. So geese have a critical period of a few hours. Harlow found that monkeys have it for 90 days, and that also applies to babies. And obviously there's dispute to how long that actually is, but it's around 2 years. So there is similarities, so therefore it can at least contribute to our understandings. And then also you've got the idea that birds or monkeys are very different to humans. Humans are much more complex. Humans have more free will. So therefore there's less kind of significance of the findings. It's not particularly relevant. The findings aren't generalizable. And overall, while it might provide some insight, ultimately research that's been conducted on humans is going to be a lot more useful to us. Is there supporting evidence? So Guiton found that he could reverse the imprinting. So Guiton is the one that when the geese were born, when the chick was born, he showed it a yellow washing up liquid, washing up glove. And their chicks were obviously trying to have sex with the yellow washing up glove. And then when they got older, they actually learned that they weren't supposed to do that and then had normal mating behaviour. So this tells us that it's fairly reversible and suggests that it might not be fully biological, because it wouldn't really make sense that they were forming an attachment with an inanimate object. And then Dollard and Miller, learning theory, they would say that the process of conditioning is how we have attachments. They are learnt rather than being innate. And then overall, you can say, although imprinting might exist, the extent to the significance of it maybe has been overestimated, and whether it's biological or not can still be questioned. Harlow, so 16 baby monkeys. There were 2 different types of mothers. So there was a plain wire monkey which dispensed milk, and then there was a cloth monkey that did not dispense milk. And they found that the monkeys spent more time on the cloth, showing that comfort was the priority for them. Maternal deprivation, so the monkeys were deprived of adequate care because they were away from their mother during this period, and there were severe consequences on them. So they were more aggressive, they were unskilled in terms of mating. Some of them actually even killed their own children when they got older, so if they were to reproduce. So they were very antisocial and aggressive, so there were lots of different kind of negative consequences. And this idea that there is a critical period and the damage done is irreversible. Evidence, Bowlby supports this idea. Maternal deprivation, there is negative consequences, so affectionless psychopathy and poor cognition are kind of documented in humans, and that supports this idea because of how the monkeys reacted, so it adds credibility. Dollard and Miller are saying that it's to do with a learning process, so it's not something that's innate, it's not something biological. We don't have a human, we don't have a drive to form those attachments. Also, food actually could be the primary drive rather than comfort. So in terms of the learning theory, obviously they're saying that food is the unconditioned stimulus that generates the attachment. So actually the food could be more significant than the milk, than the attachment, the comfort. Overall, you could say that there's a significant amount of research that supports the idea that it's negative for children to not have a primary caregiver. So therefore, regardless of the reason why attachments are formed, whether learned or biological, is clear that if they are not formed within the critical period, there are significant negative consequences. And that is the main thing that psychologists need to be aware of. Explanations of attachment learning theory. So the idea that they're learned through our nurture. So food is the unconditioned stimulus and pleasure is the unconditioned response. The caregiver starts as a neutral stimulus. Babies don't actually react to the caregiver initially, but the repeated pairing of the caregiver with the unconditioned stimulus, so the repeated pairing of the caregiver holding the milk and feeding the child, means that the caregiver develops from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, and they elicit a conditioned response. So at the end of the process, the baby forms an attachment with the caregiver because they associate them with food. And then operant conditioning, positive reinforcement. So when the baby keeps crying, they get fed. So therefore, the next time they're hungry, they cry because they've learnt to repeat that behaviour because they know what the reward is. So if you cry, you get rewarded with food. So therefore, the next time you want food, you cry. You know what's coming. Negative reinforcement. This is the idea that the mother, when she feeds the baby stops crying, so then you escape the negative situation. So you would keep repeating the behaviour of feeding the baby because you know it's going to stop the crying. So you're learning to repeat it. Is food the primary drive? Sia says yes. So caregivers provide the food, they generalise the feeling of hunger to them, so attachment is the secondary drive. Harlow's research challenges this. Comfort is more powerful than food. You could probably say that the food explanation kind of doesn't really explain how children form like future attachments, so people that don't feed them. So suggesting that actually the idea that people form attachments with people they feel safe with and comforted by is probably more valid, because Sears or Dollard and Miller's argument has kind of limited use because he can only explain why they form attachments with people who feed them, not other people. Are they formed through learned behaviours? So Hay and Vespo were talking about like modelling. So children are taught through like vicarious reinforcement or role models showing them how to demonstrate attachments, etc. So providing further credibility from social learning theory to the behaviourist argument that it's a learnt process through the environment. And then Bowlby is arguing that they aren't learnt, actually there is like an evolutionary element to it. And then you could say overall that attachment is quite like a sort of primary behaviour that we have that probably does, where animal studies do lend themselves to explaining this. So if we can see like a commonality between us and different species from the animal kingdom, then it would suggest that there is like a biological element to it, and there are obvious evolutionary advantages to forming attachments in terms of protection, etc. So we can't ignore that there must be some biological element to the initial formation. So Bowlby, obviously his idea of monotropy is the idea that it's evolutionary, it's innate, it's a survival mechanism. So monotropy, so mono, one more significant caregiver than any others. So he refers to social releases and says that this activates the adult's attachment system. So babies are cute, we like them, we want to form attachments with them. And that causes that to happen. And then the critical period. So the first attachment has to take place within the first 2 years in order to ensure that through their life they can form successful attachments. And then this idea is just that babies shouldn't be separated from their primary caregiver from long periods. So law of continuity, so essentially consistent and predictable care, and then avoiding separation for long periods. And then the internal working model, so the first attachment a child forms becomes a blueprint for all future attachments. So essentially what the kind of quality and the expectations and the consistency of your first relationship means that would inform like how you view future relationships. So it's kind of like a schema. So you develop a relationship schema, and then all future relationships you would expect to fit within that. So in terms of kind of putting this all together, you're basically saying that it's evolutionary, it's a survival mechanism, it's biological, and that can be demonstrated in this idea that babies have social releases. So that is like a biological process that activates the adult attachment system. And then you can say that they form one attachment that's more significant with all others than all others, and then explain the laws if you want to, but you probably don't need to go into too much detail. And then you can say that this initial primary attachment needs to take place within the critical period, and then you would say, and this attachment then would form their internal working model, and then you would say what the internal working model is. So think about like how this all links together essentially. Is there supporting evidence? So Shaffer and Emerson, that there's a specific stage of primary attachment, and then Banning Gendorn, no, this doesn't always apply because in different cultures they form multiple attachments from the outset. They skip that stage. So overall, psychologists need to recognise the culturally relative nature of these findings and not attempt to falsely universally apply them. Is the monotropic explanation problematic? So Erica Berman, it places too much pressure on women. If the burden of responsibility is on them, it suggests that if the primary caregiver goes back to work before the critical period is complete, then that could lead to kind of developmental issues with their child and with their quality of future attachments. And then you could say that Bowlby argued that he was saying the role of women should be valued within society. So actually highlighting the kind of significance of what women are doing. Overall, either way, it's still problematic and there's still high levels of alpha bias in these findings, or with this theory being put forward, because there is a definite focus that this was on women. Ainsworth's or actually, you could say, because obviously Bobby did say that he didn't specify it needed to be women, even though he did, but sure. Uh, then you can say in your overall that now it's much more like widely recognised that fathers can be the primary caregiver. Research by psychologists such as Field is suggesting that the primary caregiver can be male, so it's not actually guilty of alpha bias as such and gender bias, but it is still socially sensitive because it's still placing a huge burden of responsibility on the primary caregiver, suggesting that they have such a significant role to play in terms of their future development of their child. Ainsworth strange situation. So controlled observation, taking place in a strange situation. These were the different behaviours measured. So proximity seeking, exploration, stranger anxiety, separation anxiety, response to reunion. Type B, secure, most common type, and they were moderate in response to everything. Insecure avoiding, so about 20 to 25% of toddlers were classified as this reaction type. They were generally characterised by having low levels of everything. Oh, sorry, actually, high levels of exploring, but then low levels of proximity, stranger anxiety, separation anxiety, didn't require comfort upon reunion. And then insecure resistant type C, 3%, so it's obviously very rare. They were showing high levels of proximity, high levels of distress, separation anxiety, stranger anxiety, and then resisted comfort upon reunion. Sorry, is the theory. Are Ainsworth's findings like valid essentially? So BIC inter-rater reliability, so 94% of the time the team of observers agreed with the attachment type they put the child in. So obviously when you're observing separation anxiety, like how are we operationalizing high and low levels? It's quite difficult to distinguish. But so like if a baby's crying, is that high level or is that medium level? Like how are we deciding how upset the baby is? But because there was an agreement 94% of the time, it suggested that they accurately kind of operationalized the different observation categories, so therefore increased validity. A problem with the validity is that the way it was measured, what actually might have happened is that the baby's temperament, so their actual personality, is what is being measured rather than their attachment style. So, for example, a baby might explore freely, and that might make them appear that they're an avoidant attachment style, but actually that just might be more indicative of their levels of independence or curiosity levels or something like that. So it's not actually that they are insecurely attached to their caregiver, it's just their personality type. So that is a confounding variable that reduces the internal validity of the research because it wasn't measuring what it intended to. It measured temperament rather than attachment type. So overall, I mean, if the findings lack face validity, then it's very difficult to see that the findings are that useful because the experimental design needs to be changed in order to actually measure attachment type in future. So it doesn't really matter if they were putting them in the right categories or not because they weren't measuring the right thing in the first place. So ultimately the findings may have limited use if they weren't measuring what they actually intended to. Can it be used to explain attachment behaviour? So loads of studies have been conducted. I don't say loads of studies, an abundance of studies have been conducted to show kind of how your attachment style can predict future behaviours. So, childhood relationships, adolescent, romantic, etc. So, therefore, there's kind of useful practical application in terms of the findings, and it suggests that it's kind of like significant to research this topic because there's so much scope for like the impact that early attachment style have. Ainsworth, cultural bias, so limited application because it is less generalisable to other parts of the world. It also suggests that the behaviours that they've defined as secure attachment are superior. So by saying that babies should not show high levels of stranger anxiety is defined as something that would show it has a stronger attachment to you is imposed ethic, because other cultures, babies crying at strangers could actually be seen as negative behaviours that are discouraged. So the Western definition of what behaviours constitute secure attachment are problematic because it's suggesting that, yeah, for example, if a baby's crying when seeing a stranger, that's a negative behaviour and reflects an insecure attachment to you, possibly as a primary caregiver. So therefore, it's imposed ethic, and the findings kind of imply that other cultures have inferior parenting strategies. Another problem, we've got disorganised attachment. So some children didn't fit into any of the categories, so therefore that means kind of limited use if they don't fit into a category. Bryant practical application. So in Kenya, children who were deemed to be insecurely attached were supported in certain ways. So through working with the families to help them build a more secure attachment with their families. So it was useful because if children had a kind of more problematic attachment with their caregivers, then things were done, strategies were put in place to kind of resolve those issues. Cultural variations. So Banning, Gendorn and Kroonenberg did a large-scale meta-analysis, 32 studies, 1,990 children over 8 different countries, and they found that globally, so they were looking whether there were variations in the attachment styles, but they did find globally that the most common attachment style was secure. The highest country was Britain, lowest China. Insecure resistant was the least common type. Israel and Japan were the countries that had the highest level of insecure resistant. Insecure avoidant was most commonly seen in Germany, with 35% there, least common in Japan. And then this idea of within a country and between countries is interesting. So it basically tells us that actually culture could be more significant than country. So the differences, for example, in the UK between children living in kind of more rural areas compared to cities could have a more significant difference than if we compared London to Paris or other kind of major cities. So the differences between cultures are more significant within the same country than across countries. Yeah, secure attachment is the norm. And kind of both elements, so he's suggesting that it's innate because it was the most common, but then the varying rates suggest that there are still some cultural practices. And Simonelli said that it's changed over time. So in Italy, they found that the specific rate of secure attachment had decreased, and then they were arguing that that was because women were now working longer hours and they were putting their children into daycare, and that was having detrimental effects on their attachment, so they were less likely to be secure. So changes over time were showing that there was a negative impact on the attachment styles that children have. Can findings be generalised to all cultures? So large sample size and 8 different countries been included suggests that this idea that secure being the most common type could be generalizable, because you could say like the countries that were used are reflective of lots of different continents, etc., and it was a large sample. So yes, this argument that secure is the most common attachment style is generalizable. Also, this idea that the impact of anomalous results is kind of almost minimized, shall we say. So if you had like a random German child that was resistant, which is obviously a very rare attachment style in Germany, that wouldn't affect the results too much because the sample size was significant. So abnormalities within the sample were minimising their impact on the results, because in terms of percentages, if it's only 1 or 2 children out of a very large sample, then that doesn't skew the statistics too much. So large sample size, internal validity. But I think it's probably easier just to say that there was a large number of children, and the countries that were reflected in the sample include like various continents and different kind of cultural norms in terms of upbringing and parenting. If secure was the most common across those, it's quite generalizable kind of universally. But then the problem is that samples tended to be unrepresentative of culture, so not recognizing that within a country that the attachment styles might vary significantly. So for example, in London, where women are more likely to be working, children are more likely to be in nurseries, the attachment styles might be different to, I don't know, Yorkshire, shall we say, where parents are much more likely to stay at home with their children. Discussion point, are they universal? So the similarities are suggesting that it is to do with the fact that it's innate, that there are like a biological evolutionary drive to form those attachments, and that obviously can't change across cultures. But then the other argument could be like the mass media is used, and like similar parenting styles, particularly like America is kind of dominating the world's media, so lots of those would change their cultural practices across the world, because people would become more similar to America. So it's not due to innateness, it's due to global culture. Also, you could say that it's possibly not innate if it's changing. So Simonelli's study saying that if it's changing over time in Italy due to cultural practices, arguably this innate idea is not valid, because it wouldn't change if it was. And then we've already talked about this. Okay, maternal deprivation, Bowlby. So maternal deprivation. So in terms of your definition, it's when there's long-term separation from a caregiver that leads to an element of their care being lost because it's not adequately replaced. So the key thing is not just separation for long periods, it's that when they're away for long periods, that the replacement care is not adequate, so they lose an element of that. That's when it's deprivation. So critical period, we've already talked about. So the effects on development, so intellectual, lower levels of IQ, and then you've got Goldfarb to support that, so that can be supporting evidence. And emotional development, affectional psychopathy. Is there supporting evidence? So Bowlby's research on the 44 Thieves, his research shows that the children who were more likely to have had long-term separation from their mothers were more likely to be criminals when they were older. And they were more likely to be classed as affectionless in their behaviours. So suggesting that there is a correlation between maternal deprivation and criminal behaviour. Lewis repeated it and didn't find the same pattern, so essentially could not confirm his findings, sort of leading to us questioning the credibility of those findings. Overall, you could just say that there's not consistent evidence supporting this, so ultimately maybe Bowlby's findings were exaggerated, or you could say the idea that in both studies they were actually measuring separation, so it's not that clear whether these studies would be relevant to a discussion on deprivation. Positive impact on society, so useful. Robertson talking about the change in how children were cared for in care settings such as hospitals. We understand children shouldn't be away from their primary caregivers and it's detrimental to their development if they are, so changes have been made to ensure that parents can visit them in hospitals or in nurseries, etc. Key workers are allocated to ensure that there is high quality care for that child so that separation doesn't become deprivation. And then Erica Berman again, this idea that women become concerned about going back to work, that it could lead to deprivation. Yeah, and then also we've got this idea of deprivation and privation. So deprivation is when you form a primary attachment and then after that attachment has been formed, you are separated for long periods and your care is affected, is compromised as a result of that and becomes inadequate. That's deprivation. Privation is you never formed an attachment in the first place. Rutter's saying that Bowlby wasn't actually talking about deprivation, he was talking about privation. So the children that he studied, some of them had never formed an attachment with a primary caregiver in the first place. So again, that means that our kind of how we would apply those findings is different, because if women are going back to work after forming an attachment with their child, then it won't have the same effects as Bowlby's claiming. So if you form an attachment with your child and then go back to work, it's not going to affect their IQ, etc. So it's important that he distinguishes between privation and deprivation in order to allow psychologists to understand how we can apply this and how relevant this is. Effects of institutionalisation, so remaining orphanages, effects on IQ, essentially delayed intellectual development, and these differences remained. So the kind of damage was irreversible. MRI scans, there were physical differences in the size of their brains, so kind of demonstrating that the brain development didn't happen at the same pace. Physical effects. I'd say this is less relevant to talk about. So physiological issues, growth issues, etc. Emotional, so higher levels of what's called disinhibited attachments. So children being clingy, attention seeking, treating all adults in the same way and not kind of showing preference or understanding of how to act between different adults. Only 19% were securely attached. So very low levels. And then Rutter said that disinhibited attachment was kind of how they acted due to being with multiple caregivers. And then that leads us on to our discussion point. How does it contribute to our wider understanding? So in care settings, we now have this idea of key workers. So one person primarily responsible for the child helps prevent disinhibited attachments. So they're used to just one adult that they should form the attachment with, rather than kind of having lots of different caregivers and being unsure of how to act between, how to distinguish their actions and adjust their actions between different caregivers. Also, you've got this idea that, sorry, let me just double check this one. That it's limited application because this type of scenario is not reflective of practices in the UK or current society. So arguably the findings are kind of limited to the research that they conducted. It kind of has limited application to our society now because disinhibited attachment, etc., wouldn't be common because it wouldn't actually have been those types of such low kind of levels of care. So it has limited use now because that would never happen. Although, have you seen that obviously the Conservatives have said that now the quotas of like the ratio in nurseries has gone from like one nursery nurse looking after 4 children to one nursery nurse looking after 5 children. So you could say that actually maybe this type of research still needs to be considered, because if not, it kind of means that we don't really understand the reasons why we have the certain legislation in place to protect the standards of care. Is there supporting evidence for the impact? So yes, Bowlby's research on maternal deprivation, so negative impacts on intellectual and emotional development, so further credibility that if children are in institutions that aren't receiving high levels of quality care, then that will have negative detrimental consequences. And then there's a few different points to make here, but you could say that this was a very unique case, added levels of trauma, that there were kind of participant variables that could have affected it, that would mean that that wouldn't again apply to other contexts. So for example, they may have had lower levels of intellectual development due to a lack of stimulation, maybe that they would experienced trauma, etc., abuse. That could have been why they were in the institution in the first place. So that is like an extra layer, an extra variable that could have caused these effects. It's not necessarily a direct relationship between institutionalization and intellectual and emotional development. And again, this idea that psychologists need to distinguish between deprivation and privation. So are we talking about children that never formed attachments, that went into care initially from birth, or are we talking about children that did form attachments and then were placed in an institution and obviously receiving inadequate care? So that distinction needs to be made before we kind of decide whether Bowlby's research can actually support this and how useful the findings are. Influence on later relationships. So there's quite a lot of studies here, and I feel like generally people find it harder to remember these studies. Any question that asks you about later relationships, Bowlby always works, and this idea of internal working model. So if you explain Bowlby and the internal working model, that will get you 3 or 4 marks probably. So mental representation, so blueprint for all future relationships. If you have a secure attachment as a child, then as an infant, your childhood, adolescent and adult relationships are much more likely to follow that pattern. So impact on childhood, friendships. So if you were secure attachment as an infant, you're likely to have the most successful friendships, and you're more likely to have problematic friendship difficulties, fallouts, etc. if you are insecurely attached as an infant. In terms of bullying, the insecure avoidant were most likely to be the victims, and insecure resistant were the bullies, and secure were least likely to be involved in bullying. Hazen and Shaver, so those who were securely attached, kind of strongest, most stable relationships, less likely to get divorced. Avoiding fear of intimacy, fear of commitment, insecure resistant, obsessive, high levels of jealousy. So if you think insecure avoidant, obviously they don't want to be in relationships because they have a negative perception of what relationships are, whereas insecure resistant are much more likely to be sort of clingy. They want to be in a relationship. When they are left, often as in their partner goes out or something like that, they might feel sort of betrayed, and then when they come home they're more likely to kind of reject the comfort, etc., and reassurance from their partner. So it's kind of much more likely to be an issue for them. Impact on the children. So essentially, children tend to be the same attachment style as their parents, so or their mother in this case. So as their mother. So sorry, I'm just watching the football and I got distracted for a brief second. The reason being, so if your mother's secure, then you're more likely to kind of model that behaviour and have the same understanding of what relationships should be like and have the same expectations and follow those. If your mother is insecure resistant, then you're used to that kind of inconsistent level of care. You're used to your mother being very clingy at stages and then being confused about kind of more hostile behaviour, and then you're likely to model that with your children. So being clingy with your own children kind of causes them to be clingy towards you, etc. So the overprotective parent causes their child to be more dependent on them. And then the dependent child gets more upset, obviously, when their mother is kind of inconsistent with the care. And then avoidant, obviously, if as a baby you received kind of low levels of responses to your emotions, etc., then that kind of leads to the baby withdrawing. So then in the future, they become more avoidant because they kind of see relationships as a bit of a disappointment and where their expectations and needs aren't met. So they kind of withdraw and become more self-reliant. So they're the reasons why, which you would need to kind of explain in a larger question. Is there supporting evidence? McCarthy provides supporting evidence. So she basically talks about different stages through life. So they were most likely to have best friendships and romantic relationships if they were securely attached. Insecure, resistant had problems maintaining, and insecure avoidance struggled with ever getting in them, or like a level of closeness. Zimmerman, this idea that actually there is conflicting evidence, that it doesn't show that much significance. Early attachment type, there isn't much of a correlation between that and quality of later relationships. So overall, you could say the evidence is inconsistent. So initial research into the significance of the internal working model has potentially been overestimated. Can we trust the research? So it's largely based on self-report techniques. So that's problematic because obviously people reflecting on their childhood experiences may not be particularly valid. So subjective is retrospective. So retrospective means like looking into the past. So as an adult, trying to remember early caregiver experiences, or even early friendships at school, etc., are difficult. People might reframe their memories, etc., and they're not particularly accurate. Also, a person's past does not determine, so it's overly deterministic. It doesn't kind of account for the free will that humans have to reject kind of the influence of their past relationships and aim to have kind of more successful relationships in the future, possibly. Overall, oh God, I mean, Jesus. The research just say that there are significant kind of issues with both the methodology and the conclusions made. So therefore, the research at this stage has limited use because we cannot really fully trust the findings. Socially sensitive, it's problematic to suggest that if you had like poor relationships that will be a burden throughout your life. And also Erica Berman again, that this is a problem because it emphasises the role of women, and if children are being bullied at school or bullies at school, etc., then it kind of calls into question whether that was to do with the way that the mother socialised them as a child. There we go. That is attachment. Good luck with your revision. I can't stop the bloody video.